They thought the moment would break me, that the carefully arranged setting and polite audience would force me into silence while the narrative was written without my consent. But what they didn't know was that the story had already been finalized long before the first glass of water was poured on the tables. The charity luncheon was held in a sunlit hall downtown, the kind of place designed to look generous and important without being ostentatious. Long tables draped in white linen, centerpieces of pale flowers chosen to offend no one, the quiet clink of crystal as people settled into their seats, applause that came easily, because it was expected, not because it was felt. I arrived early and sat alone 3 tables back from the podium, positioned perfectly to observe without being noticed, wearing a plain gray suit that blended into the background, no accessories that suggested status, no visible marker that hinted at authority. My posture relaxed, but attentive hands folded loosely as if I were simply another guest who had come to listen and eat and leave. Across the room stood my mother-in-law, Eleanor Whitmore, a woman who had spent her entire life mastering the art of appearing gracious while executing control with surgical precision, dressed in a tailored ivory suit that reflected the light just enough to draw attention, pearls resting neatly at her collarbone, her smile warm and practiced, the kind that reassured donors and intimidated subordinates at the same time. Beside her sat my wife Lillian in a soft blue dress she had chosen carefully, eyes downcast, fingers laced tightly. Together in her lap, her stillness speaking louder than anything she might have said aloud, because she knew what was coming, or at least she thought she did. I listened as conversation softened and the room turned toward the podium, and as Eleanor cleared her throat with deliberate timing, I felt the familiar calm that had followed me through 16 years of professional life. Years spent as a compliance and risk consultant for large institutions where nothing was ever loud, where influence lived in footnotes, deadlines, and clauses written in language most people skim past. Years spent understanding not just how systems functioned when everything went right, but how they collapsed when ego replaced preparation, and how the quietest person in the room often held the most leverage. Eleanor began with warmth, addressing the audience as friends and family, speaking about transparency and values, about honesty as if it were a virtue she had invented, her voice steady, confident, designed to carry just far enough to sound intimate while still commanding attention. And then, with a pause that felt rehearsed down to the second, she shifted the tone, explaining that honesty sometimes required difficult conversations, that growth sometimes meant letting go, that accountability was the foundation of progress. And as the room stiffened in that subtle way people do when they sense discomfort approaching, she turned slowly toward me, eyes narrowing just enough to ensure I understood I was the subject of this performance, and announced that today would be the day the separation between her daughter and me would be made public, that it was time to acknowledge what she described as an inevitable conclusion. Her words met with a few sympathetic murmurs, a few surprised gasps, heads turning instinctively toward me to observe my reaction. I didn't move, didn't speak, didn't even adjust my posture, because this wasn't news, not to me, and certainly not something that warranted a public response, because 2 weeks earlier, in a quiet office far removed from this polished spectacle, I had already filed the necessary paperwork, clean and thorough with terms, carefully negotiated and notarized custody arrangements, clearly outlined assets protected in a way that left no ambiguity, and a mutual non-disparagement clause sealed so tightly that any attempt to weaponize public opinion would collapse under its own weight. Eleanor waited, expecting shock or anger or embarrassment, perhaps even a plea, but when none came, she pressed forward, reiterating her point with more emphasis, framing the announcement as a moral obligation, as an act of courage. And that was when a man seated at the head table stood up calmly, almost reluctantly, a man most people had overlooked until that moment, wearing a dark blazer and reading glasses that slipped slightly down his nose, holding a legal pad under one arm, like someone accustomed to observing rather than performing. He cleared his throat gently and apologized for interrupting his voice, even professional, carrying none of the drama the moment seemed to demand, and introduced himself as the family's legal advisor, explaining that there was a clarification that needed to be made because the divorce being announced had already been filed, finalized, and documented not by Eleanor, but by me 14 days earlier. The silence that followed was immediate and complete, the kind that presses against your ears and forces everyone in the room to confront the shift in power they hadn't seen coming. And as the advisor adjusted his glasses and continued, explaining that all terms had been accepted and that public statements by either party were restricted under the agreement, Eleanor's carefully constructed expression collapsed, her confidence draining as realization set in that the stage she had built no longer belonged to her. Lillian looked up then, confusion and relief crossing her face in equal measure, and Eleanor stared at me with a mixture of disbelief and accusation, whispering that I had planned this, to which I responded by standing just enough to acknowledge the moment without claiming it, my voice low, steady, and free of resentment as I explained that I hadn't planned a confrontation, only dignity, that I wasn't interested in turning our private decisions into public entertainment, and that preparation didn't require cruelty. The luncheon ended early after that, people leaving quietly, conversations unfinished, the energy drained not by conflict, but by clarity. And outside, Eleanor approached me again, her posture no longer rigid, her voice stripped of performance as she admitted that I had outmaneuvered her, a word I gently rejected, explaining that I hadn't fought at all, that I had simply chosen not to engage on a stage designed for humiliation. Later that night, as the noise of the day faded, and I sat alone reflecting on what had unfolded, I realized something that 16 years of quiet, professional experience had taught me again in a deeply personal way. Strength doesn't always announce itself. Power doesn't need witnesses, and revenge doesn't have to be loud to be effective. Sometimes the strongest response is preparation, restraint, and allowing the truth to arrive calmly, carried not by raised voices or dramatic gestures, but by documents, foresight, and the refusal to be pulled into a spectacle that was never meant to serve anyone but the person who staged it. And in that realization, I felt something settle inside me, not triumph, not bitterness, but peace, because I had protected what mattered without destroying what didn't, and I had proven, quietly and completely, that dignity can be its own form of victory.